Dan, welcome.
Hey, everyone.
You made it. So we are missing our moderator, Kat Rambo. She sent me a Twitter DM and said, could you take over moderating? She can't get in. When she pops in, I'm sure she has a list of amazing questions, but we will just start with what we have. Introductions first. My name is T.J. Barry. I am a novelist. I wrote the space opera novels Space Unicorn Blues and 5 Unicorn Flush. Here is what one of them looks like. And I write in fantasy, science fiction, and horror. And I am also a podcaster. I've had my own podcast for 2 years, and I've been on about 24 podcasts over the years, the last couple of years, since the debut of my first novel as a guest. So I have a lot of experience being a guest on a podcast. So, we have a lot to talk about on how to be a good guest. So, Jay, if you'd like to introduce yourself next.
For sure. So I am J.R.H. Lawless. I'm a science fiction mainly author from Atlanta, Canada. My perspective in terms of podcasts is more as a debut author in the present situation, which is obviously brilliant timing to release your first book. I've been sort of, trying as much as possible, to do promotion, compensate for the fact that all the launch events and everything that was planned, physical ones, are obviously not happening. So try to compensate as much as possible in the wonderful world of writing community and SFF fandom podcasts. I've been lucky enough to be on a good few ones, including one with a former co-host of yours, TJ. If this goes on, Don't Panic, which is an awesome one, which definitely go check out. All about Hope Punk. I said that's the first of many shout outs. I promised multiple ones. So a few other ones. So definitely my perspective is as a debut author, as a guest on podcasts, the ones I've been able to get on, the ones I'm still open. If anybody out there wants to pop me an invite on Twitter, definitely go for it. I would be very happy to be on any podcast at this point. And there are so many great ones out there. But also as a writer, from a craft point of view, there are so many amazing podcasts that bring you, think about something like Writing Excuses, for instance, which was brilliant for me. And obviously, I'm sure all of you out there, most of you out there, especially if you're tuning into this panel, know all about it. Just fantastic. From a craft point of view and just from a human and entertainment point of view. So, definitely, podcasts are more important than ever now, and that's definitely, I think, why this panel is top notch.
It's true. More than ever, I find myself connecting through podcasts because there's a few pop-up ones about COVID-19 and local areas. So more than ever, this is a great way that people can connect with each other from inside their homes. So
Absolutely.
Dan, let's go to you. Tell us about yourself and what experience you have with podcasting.
Sure. My name is Dan Stout. I'm a freelance writer and author. I think I'm probably best known for the Carter Archives, which is a series of fantasy noir novels from Daw Books. I also write short stories and pretty much anything that someone will pay me money to write. And I am an obsessive podcast listener, and podcasts are my favorite way to help spread the word about my own work and to meet new people and to expand my community. So it's just one of my favorite things, and I'm really looking forward to talking about it with you guys and with everyone in the chat room.
That's fantastic. I hear the term obsessive podcast listener. And so last night I was looking at my list to seeing how many I'm subscribed to. And it turns out I'm subscribed to 42 podcasts. And I don't actually get to listen to all of them because it's impossible. There's not enough time in the week. But I just love it. It's such a great medium. And they can take so many more risks as far as content and guests than you can on a produced television show or a film where you've got a lot of people invested in making the outcome a success. Podcasts, it's easy to fail. And I've definitely failed at podcasts. So, it's great to see some of the best, most interesting, in-depth interviews going on in the podcast arena. So let's start off with the easy stuff. What are some podcasts we absolutely love, and what about them do we think they do well? So I'll give you a minute to kind of percolate, and I will go with one of the ones that I absolutely love is called Reply All. So this is two friends, two guys who have this podcast, and the subject of the podcast is basically anything internet related, which in this day and age can be anything. I mean, you could talk about a smart fridge, you could talk about online dating, you could talk about, you know, getting webcams to work. Anything really falls under internet. But they have this magical rapport with each other that makes it so enjoyable that they gently rib each other. You can tell that they're friends. And so not only are they presenting interesting and in-depth information about these internet related subjects, they're doing it in a way where you feel like you're sitting in with a couple of buddies. So it's incredibly interesting. And the foundation of it is very well researched episodes about things like why do Domino's pizza franchises get random orders for one single 12-ounce bottle of Coke that subsequently gets canceled. And they go in depth and they research and they figure out why Domino's pizzas across the world report this one single bottle of soda order coming in. So you'll have to go look up the episode and figure out what it was. But that is why I love it. It is the combination of the hosts' charisma and their interaction with each other, coupled with this incredibly in-depth reporting on things that no one even would think to report about in mainstream news. These are interesting, fun little topics that pique our curiosity. So Dan, let's start with you. What's a podcast you absolutely love and why?
I'll tell you one that I absolutely love is NPR's StoryCorps, and that's it's recordings of people who go in, and it's usually one person and a friend or a family member, and they talk about one moment in their life that was really impactful on them, really pivoted the way that their life was developing. And it's a really fascinating, I mean, it's beautiful, it's heart-wrenching, it's emotional. Half the time you're either bent over in half laughing or you're crying by the end of it, because it's people's most emotional moments. And from a storytelling point of view, seeing people's most emotional moments and the way they express it and the way they reflect back on it, and seeing how sometimes those moments are the smallest things and sometimes they're the biggest things. There's a lot to learn and to kind of take apart as a writer and a storyteller there as well. And let's see, you know, I actually have, I don't know if this is okay or not, I keep on my blog, I keep a list of my favorite podcasts.
Oh yeah, tell us your top ones.
Yeah, I mean, I got over 100 on here. I'm, like I said,
maybe pick like your top 10.
I'm a big nerd, but yeah, it's just the idea of going in and finding the ways that people break stuff apart, either for a storytelling point of view or actually diving into the craft of prose. I'll dump that into the chat right now.
Awesome, that's fantastic. Oh, very organized, a whole list. So Jay, tell us about your favorite and why.
Well, I already obviously said the easy, obvious, and essential one, title reference, which are obviously Ready Excuses, which is for if anybody
Definitely.
for some reason does not know it yet, they should do. What the hell have you been doing with your life, first of all? And two, it's designed as a masterclass, and it's super funny. I mean, the participants don't even need presenting. Fantastic. So just do yourself a favor, go check it out. Other than that, there's one we need to go a bit more obscure. One I really enjoyed, actually. I was a guest on recently. It's the last one I was a guest on. It's a small college-based podcast, science fiction and writing, both craft and fandom podcast in St. John's, Newfoundland, so here on the Atlantic east coast of Canada. And it was brilliant. So because, well, first of all, it was my first time on a old school podcast, which is also on radio. So the old radio waves were going with the podcast, which was interesting. The origins of podcasting. But also it was great because Matt LeDrew, who presented it, he owns a small press in St. John's as well. And so we were chatting, and it was really just like sort of what you were saying, TJ, like a real sort of open, just almost buddies chatting, about books and about writing and craft and just sharing books and sharing ideas. It was really, I had such a great time just, just chatting quite openly with him on this podcast and radio show, which, yeah, so that's called the Write Project. Write is obviously writing. And yeah, so yeah, I think he'd be very chuffed if anybody wanted to Google the Write Project. It's Memorial University College Radio, so
That's awesome. Yeah, yeah.
podcasts are
It's,
so
at some point we can, if anybody wants, we can go and paste a few of these in the Discord if people want to, if somebody who's even an attendee wants to pop them into the chat so people know we've mentioned reply all and writing excuses and some of the bigger ones, but some of the smaller ones as well. There's one going on right now, kind of a pop-up podcast called Coronavirus in California, which I've been listening to 10 minutes every morning. Gustav Ariano from the LA Times interviews various on-the-ground people. So these don't have to be like the Department of Health in California. This is a nurse who works in Orange County, or at one point he interviewed a mariachi band director, because mariachi, this is a big season for them. There's graduations, there's summer parties. Mariachi can't be hired right now. They can't even get together to practice. And because of the delays on Zoom meetings, they can't even do virtual practice. The music is just too difficult. So they're stuck. And so there's the loss of income. There's, the loss of their, the thing they love to do, which is music. Never would have thought, how does coronavirus impact mariachi? But something that, he was able to pull up by talking to people on the ground. So I think podcasts fill this wonderful role that local newspapers in some ways used to fill, where you can just get out there with even as much as a telephone, you can use your smartphone, and you won't get pristine audio, but you'll get a good enough piece of communication. So since this panel is mostly geared toward writers who will be on podcasts, maybe we can talk a little bit about how to be a good podcast guest. So while both of you kind of percolate on some of your tips for being a good podcast guest, I will start off, and I will tell you the story of a disaster that happened to me on a podcast that for right now shall remain nameless, but I might tell you what it is in a minute. We got on the podcast and we had people from around the globe, and we got ready to do this very intense academic Q&A on a short story, and my audio had an echo. And I let the podcast host know, and I said, there's a problem. And we tried for 20 minutes to fix that echo. And this was the only time we had been able to gather all of the guests together. We had people from the UK, we had people from the East Coast of America, the West Coast. And so there was no rescheduling this. And so after about 20 minutes, they were like, well, what are we going to do? And I said, I will do it with the echo. So it was like singing the national anthem with my own voice coming back to me on a 2-second delay. And I had to figure out how to know what to listen to. It was really difficult, but we did it. And it didn't show up in the audio. So I don't know what happened, and it never happened again, thank goodness. But sometimes, so one of my top tips, that if you are on a podcast, sometimes you just have to roll with it. Like today, we are on a panel and our moderator was not able to get in. You just roll with it, especially in these times. Everyone understands we are all human. We are all trying to just get to the same goal. So if something happens on a podcast, perhaps you show up and they say, oh, did you bring your recommendation for book of the week? And you're like, ooh, I didn't. Take a moment and know that we're all on the same page. We're all looking for the same goal, and go with it. And that's fine. So let's start with you, Jay. Do you have any recommendations for being a guest on a podcast?
Well, first of all, I think just be, even though, as I was saying before, it is a performance, and we all have our props and books that we're pushing and whatnot.
Exactly.
But at the same time, just be yourself. Just be human, as you say. Especially in these times, we all know that we are all doing what we can to make the best out of a horrendous situation and do what we can to fix it. But there's not that much we can do on the individual level other than the basics that we should all be doing. So it's trying times for everybody, and as you say, today proves but at the same time, podcasts have never been more important. Like, I think, like we've been saying, it's funny to hear the last Rick and Morty episode, somebody like Dan Harmon, who is a major podcaster, has been for years and years, say make fun of podcasts, and summer is listening to a podcast. Oh, let's all pretend podcasts are relevant. Well, they are. They really, really are. And when that line was written, it was probably pre-COVID, and just now podcasts are more relevant than ever.
Yeah, more than ever.
So that's it's quite interesting to see.
Yeah.
In terms of personal, I mean, I found one of the biggest challenges for me on podcasts is sort of keeping what I say in check, because you always have to have that self-consciousness, and you want to be natural, but at the same time, it's very easy just to, go on and not, necessarily, like I'm doing right now, it's all meta, like Rick and Morty, but to stay within the boundaries of the exercise. It's always something you have to keep in mind while still trying to be natural and being spontaneous and hopefully relatively interesting in what you're saying. It's it's all a challenge.
Yeah, you're basically spinning plates, trying to be interesting but not take over the conversation. And there's a lot to think about.
As you say, everybody needs to have their time, and that's vital. So it's all a balancing act. But then again, so is writing, and so is everything else. So I think we're
True.
old hands at this point.
Excellent. Dan, how about you? Do you have any tips for a podcaster being on a podcast?
Really, it's kind of listening and familiarizing yourself with the podcast at least a little bit. You probably can't listen to every episode that podcast has put out, but you can check out one or two, even if you sort of skim through it at the very least. Where you'll find out kind of the tone that the hosts are adapting. You'll find out the things that they're focusing on, and you'll find out if they always ask the same questions, usually either at the beginning of the interview or at the end of the interview. So what's your 2 best tips for writers, or, how did you get started? And then you'll kind of know what's coming at you. And then you can prepare and find the little things that work for you. I was I was in speech therapy for years and years. So I'm very self-conscious about the way I talk. So I find that I do a couple things, like I'll put Post-it notes all around the monitor out of sight of the camera that just remind me to do things with my voice or to talk about certain topics. And sometimes they're ridiculous things. Like I have to put a Post-it note that says, mention the book, because otherwise I can go through an entire conversation and forget to mention, yeah, I wrote a book, you can buy it. Here's how you do that. And it's just finding out what you need, and don't be ashamed to use those crutches or tools or whatever it is to help the podcast host deliver the best value to their audience.
I love that. And I kind of want to jump off from there because, when we talk about over preparation, I'm going to hold up my 7-page document of all my notes for this panel because I was afraid that something would happen and I might end up as the moderator. And guess what? That's what happened. So I tend to write out all of my notes. And even if I never look at my notes, the act of writing them out helps my brain solidify some of the things I'd like to talk about. So if you're invited onto a podcast and you're an author and you're new to this, number one, be prepared. So one of the things you can do, like Dan, you say, is listen to a few episodes of the podcast, get a feel for the tone, get a feel for, is this a conversational style or is it more very straight Q&A? There's one podcast I listened to where the interviewer has a set 10 questions and he asks them, and you can hear him clicking check marks on his computer every time the guest answers. And even if the person says something incredibly interesting in their answer, he does not follow up. He goes to the next question. So you need to know that when you're a guest, right? Like you need to know he's not going to follow up on anything interesting. So if I have a good story, just tell it myself. He's not going to prompt me. So Jay, did you have your hand up or you just
I'm just sort of illustrating the point you were saying there, but I will take advantage of that too.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Also warn that also obviously do everything you can to prepare, but also be prepared for the unexpected as much as possible, because there will be so many things, particularly from a technical point of view, that will be either go wrong, or if they do, even if they go as intended, be completely different from any other podcast that you've done. I mean, I've only done about maybe half a dozen, but of the ones that I've done, I don't think a single one has been the same. It's been some have been call-ins to California on my landline, to call into a conference call, cut out by interviews of Anthony Daniels as C-3PO, and just absolute, that was a sci-fi talk between Collado, which was really interesting, but it was just completely alien. Some have been, on Twitch. I've done them on Twitch again. Shout out to If This Goes On, Don't Panic, the new format of your former co-host, which is awesome. It's number 2. I need to get 3 in to qualify, I think, to load that. And some it'll always be different, yeah. And some will actually be multiple shows in one recording, where you'll record your actual podcast, and then you'll record interview questions, and those interview questions will be on a completely different episode, that they'll be using just to fill in their schedule. So there'll be so much, so just, I think, be prepared as much as possible, but also be prepared to roll with it, because that will inevitably happen.
Absolutely. And you can even ask your host, what questions are you going to ask me? Some hosts like the spontaneity of having you answer right away, but I mean, especially if you have anxiety, if you're neurodivergent and you need to have the questions in advance, do not feel bad about asking. Say, it really helps me to be able to prepare my answers in advance. You can write them down, and even if you don't end up referring to them, you will feel secure knowing you have the tools you need in case your mind goes blank. You can simply read off of the page. And just that bit of preparation will make you 90% more prepared than most people who go on a podcast. A few other things you might want to ask your host. Is this a podcast where I can swear or be saucy? Some hosts, don't want any kind of profanity because their audience is very mixed. Some hosts are delighted if you come on and tell saucy stories, and that's the tone of their podcast. If you get on the podcast and you do not know, stick with the kindergarten rule. Do not say anything you would not say in front of a kindergartner. There are some words that, heck, we might think, oh, that's not terribly profane, but someone else may be offended by this. So stick with, if you're not sure, the level of sauciness or profanity, don't do it. And I only say this as a warning because I have a truck driver mouth and I have to be really careful about it. So, you also may want to know, how long is your appearance going to be? If this is a 10-minute podcast, that's going to be much different than if it's a 1-hour podcast. You're going to have a lot more time to expand upon stories. And in those 10 minutes, you need to get to the most important things, so managing your time will be helpful if you know how long. One other thing that I think is really helpful is, this is like advanced level podcast guest, is borrow a lesson from the improv comedy community. So if your interviewer asks you, hey, do you like Lovecraft? And you say, no. And that's it. You have just killed the conversation. But if they say, do you like Lovecraft? And you say, no, but I really enjoy Kij Johnson's novella, The Dream Quest of Velvet Bow, which is in direct conversation with Lovecraft. And it ends up being a story about a really badass woman on a journey. Now you've given your podcast host a hook into an interesting story and conversation. So the two things that you can do is yes and no but. So do you like Lovecraft? No, but here's a little story that you can hook into. Do you like Lovecraft? Yes, and he was my great uncle. Give a little something that people can hook onto. So let's think. Are there any times when you've had podcasts where it's been really tough? Like perhaps you have someone who is not listening, or you've had a technical issue, and maybe how have you gotten through it? Anything come to mind? Dan, anything? You can shout out if you haven't thought of anything.
Yeah, I've actually been very lucky with the technical aspects of the podcast I've been on. So
yeah, that's really good.
Yep.
Anything, Jay, come to mind? Because I have stories.
One thing I suppose can be a challenge, which is sort of what you were saying before as well. Asking about profanity and what sort of the tolerance level is there, what's allowed, what isn't allowed. Also, political discussion, because I remember once, and this is going to be my third reference, ding, ding, ding. We have if this goes on, don't panic. Bingo is called, because on there it's about folk punk, and it's a whole theme, which is why it's such a great podcast. And we have with Sable Radio as a co-host, we have a lot of discussions about obviously politics and the current political situation. As a lawyer, I was having, I was called on to give my opinion on obviously, and I was happy to do so, about the impact of current situation on civil liberties and the evolution of of our political systems. And that's not something that you would necessarily do on every podcast or even most podcasts. It's because of the identity of the podcast, and obviously it was the host and the co-host were bringing up this subject, which is a very good signal that that's something you're allowed to talk about in terms of branding and podcast identity. But that's something obviously you want to be very careful about, just as you would in everyday discussion, I suppose, but even more so when you're presenting and it's in a public forum. So that's just another sort of little, just like as you were saying about swearing, you don't,
Right.
you only do that when you know it's an appropriate, appropriate environment.
Yeah, like know the venue. And also if you've done your research and you've listened to the podcast before, and maybe they have an angle that you wouldn't be comfortable speaking in conversation with those people, maybe it's a political angle or some sort of viewpoint, feel free to turn down a podcast opportunity. There are very few make or break podcast opportunities out there. So if something makes you uncomfortable for some reason, you can say, no, thanks, this is not for me. And that's perfectly fine. Even if you have a publicist, they'll be willing to turn it down for you. I'm going to just throw it out that if anybody has questions, we're in the Aramis Discord. So as we're kind of coming toward the end of things, you can pop your questions in there and I'll be able to see them. And I do have a few other tips that are kind of granular. So we have the big ones, right? We talked about being prepared. We talked about, borrowing lessons from improv. We talked about researching. We've talked about, just go with it. Then there's some like granular ones, right? So here's a big one that's a pet peeve of mine. Don't eat while you're on the podcast. And you think this would go without saying, but there's a podcast that I listen to where the hosts eat lunch with each other and that's when they record. So all you hear is, and it's a lot. It's really a lot, especially for someone who has misophonia. It's a lot. So I would not recommend eating. Drinking, I think, is fine because you're doing a lot of talking and you can get a little bit dry. But eating and gum can be really tough to listen to. Something for people who wear jewelry, watch the jangly jewelry, especially if you have a microphone up here and you have dangly earrings, you'll just get this hitting sound all the time. So this is a little bit of technical stuff, but it's stuff that will make a difference for your audio. Pets and kids out of the room. Although these days with the global pandemic, people are more willing to tolerate the noise of pets and kids because it's a break from the ordinary. But typically, if you're recording something and you know that you have the ability to shut everybody out, do that. Close your windows. You may even have to turn off air conditioners. Sometimes the noise of an air conditioner can ruin a podcast. Let's see. Oh, and the couple of things to have ready. So if you're about to be on there, have a drink ready. So bring your water, just in case you've been talking a bunch. Sometimes I have cough drops just in case something happens. Notes, and yeah. And just like Dan was saying, where you sometimes have to put the note of the most obvious thing. Sometimes I write out my own bio with my own name at the top because I will sometimes get so nervous in the beginning that I will forget to introduce myself, or I'll be like, oh, I'm TJ. Oh yeah. So don't be afraid to put the most obvious stuff on your notes. Who you are, the name of your book, or have your book nearby like Jay does. That's totally fine, and no one's going to see it. Even on a thing like today, you guys don't even see the stuff that is like all around me that I could possibly be using today. If it makes you feel better, those are your tools to feeling relaxed enough to have a good conversation. Are there anything else that either of you did today to make it work? So have anything near you or prepare anything. I see Mela in the chat says, don't drink carbonated drinks. So you might end up burping on your on your podcast. I would also add, watch out for things that are milk based. because it may make your mouth, feel a little sticky and a little harder to talk, but that's up to you. You have to figure out what works for you. Any other tips from you guys?
Basic sort of social media promotion, stuff like that as well. Sorry, Dan.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
no, that's a really good point. That's something I usually forget about, to be honest with you. No, many of the same things that you were touching on already. I always have some cough drops, a beverage. I usually do a caffeinated beverage and a water, because sometimes the caffeinated is a little too rough for my throat. And I'll often do some vocal warm-ups before the call or the video. And if you're doing a video podcast, a lot of times it's nice to put something up near the camera to keep you looking at that rather than
Okay.
down at the host. Just it looks a little bit sharper and more professional.
Yeah.
I often actually didn't make a little post-it note with a smiley face or draw a person on there because I'm a nerd and that makes me feel better.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, and just kind of lean into again, like all those little tools and things that help you out.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of bring up, if you're on video, maybe the podcast tapes from a Google Hangout or a Zoom call, or maybe like this, you're on a panel, which overlaps with podcasting in many ways. Some of the things you can do is lift your webcam so that it's at your height. You don't really want it to be looking up at you. So like I've got mine on the big, huge box of the game of photosynthesis. So I've got a board game ready in case the one breaks out. Like you say, Dan, put something up near your webcam so that you're looking up and not looking down at your things. Good lighting. And for people who wear makeup, you may want to wear more makeup than usual because webcams can tend to wash you out. So you may want to make sure that you put a little pop more makeup on, so that you're not quite as pale as usual.
Gary,
Vocal, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Gary just said that apparently we're ending in less than a minute.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so that's good to know. So yeah, any parting thoughts? This would be probably a very good time for everyone who has taken the opportunity to put their social media on a Post-it note near their near their thing to tell everybody where you're located. So Dan, do you want to tell us where we can find you online?
Sure, you can find me at danstout.com, or you can find me on Twitter at danstout.
Awesome. And Jay, where can we find you?
At Space Lawyer SF on Twitter, and lawlessauthor.com for the website. I also have 2 more panels at the Flights of Foundry here, one today, one tomorrow. And I also have a reading planned and a solo presentation on law in SFF world building. So please, the more the merrier.
Sounds wonderful. And I am on Twitter at tjaneberry. That's the best place to reach me. And thank you both for being here. We kind of had a few technical issues in the beginning, but we figured it out. And I hope everybody had a good time and learned some things.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Yep. So I think we just have to hang out until we are dismissed.
Yeah, this time, the after party.
Yeah, this is the hangout.
Oh, it's really great meeting you guys.
Yeah, it was great to chat with
Same
you.
here.
We made it work. I feel bad Kat wasn't able to get on the stream.
But that's why I wanted to plug, if this goes on, don't panic so much, because Kat is the co-host. So even though she wasn't, she was with us in spirit.
Yeah, which is a great podcast. Very thorough, very, I don't know anything about Hope Punk, so,
Well, I learned a lot about it, and I realized that, in fact, without putting the name on it, Always Rena is very much Hope Punk. So.
Yay!